Hey, what's going on? I'm Matt, and today we're going over some Laravel basics. So I was kind of just YouTubing some Laravel tutorials, and for some reason, all of these tutorials are like 4 hours long. So, and let's be honest, like nobody really wants to watch like a 4-hour video on YouTube. By the end of this video, you'll know how to make a basic application in Laravel. You'll understand how to make views, create models and migrations, basic routing, and inserting and editing records in the database. All right, so what are we going to build? We're going to build a simple CRUD application, and the most common CRUD application is just like a simple to-do list. So, and by the end of building like this to-do list, you'll know how to make a simple application in Laravel. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so we're going to obviously start with just creating a new Laravel project. So we're going to go ahead and paste that in here. Let's call it to-do list. We're going to go ahead and create that. Okay, so let's cd into our to-do list app. I'm going to run PHP artisan serve to run the actual app. Okay, with that running, we can go to localhost 8000, and there we go. We ran PHP artisan serve. We got our basic standard brand new Laravel app running. So we can go ahead and get started. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is just change this view up to basically be a to-do list. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so this is the basic welcome page. It's inside resources, views, and the file is called welcome.blade.php. So right now it has like all this kind of stuff, and we don't really need any of that. So we're going to go ahead and just remove it. So inside this div, going to look. Okay, so it's everything in here. Let's just make sure that works. So refresh the page. There we go. Everything's gone. I'm just going to create an H1 here, call it to-do list. Let's make sure that's showing up. There we go. Okay, so simple to-do list, maybe an input. Okay, so we got an input. So all I did, add a title. And we have two elements here, so a label and an input. And as you see here, pretty simple, just to-do list. Okay, yeah, I'm gonna make everything white so we can, like the text white so we can see it easier. There we go. Okay, so we got our basic to-do list view. And right now, obviously, actually, I just realized we need a button to save the list item. Okay, so since I'm kind of like doing this very fast, I'm not gonna be like following every best practice that you should follow. But if you're just learning the platform, or like, sorry, if you're just learning the framework for the first time, like don't really worry about following best practices. Just try and like understand how things work basically. Okay, so we got our basic to-do list view here, and obviously right now like it doesn't do anything. You can type into the input and you can click the save button, but nothing happens. So we basically can now just start making it work. And the first thing we need to do is basically hook up our Laravel app to a database. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to open Table Plus. I'm going to open my local database. I'm going to click here. These are my local databases. And then I'm going to create a new one. So let's just call this to-do list. Going to go ahead and open it up. Okay, so obviously right now there's nothing under tables because we haven't created any. But so that creates the database on like our local MySQL installation, which obviously, like I guess I should mention that like you need MySQL or Postgres, whatever type of database you're using, you kind of need it installed locally for this to work. But that's like out of scope of this this video. Okay, so we created our database locally through Table Plus. Now we want to hook it up to our actual Laravel app. So you're going to go ahead and open up your env file, which is where you set up all your environment variables. And then all you really want to do is change the database to whatever you titled your database on Table Plus. So username and password is what you're going to set up when you actually have like when you install MySQL for the first time. Since I already have that up and running, I don't need to do that. Okay, now that we got our database hooked up to our Laravel app, the next thing we need to do is create the models and migrations for our to-do list. And if you don't know what models or migrations are, that's totally fine. Don't worry about it. I'll explain that in a second. But let's go ahead and just create the models and migrations first. So, okay, so the command to make a model is pretty self-explanatory. So it's obviously PHP artisan make model, and then the name of the actual model that you want. And then the -m at the end is for migration. So we want to create both a model and migration, and this is one way to do it in one command. So go ahead and run that, and you can see that the model's created and the migration is also created. Okay, so I'm just going to double check that our database is actually hooked up to our Laravel app correctly. And to do that, I just basically run the migration. So to run the migration, you just type PHP artisan migrate. Okay, there you go. So when I refresh here in Table Plus, all of our tables are here, which basically means that everything's hooked up correctly and everything's good to go. Okay, so when we create our migration, it's going to create a file inside the database folder, inside migrations, and then there's going to be the latest one, which is called create list items table. And we don't actually need the other tables here. or the other migrations. So I'm going to go ahead and delete them. This is how you're going to store basically the list items that we create. Okay, so we have to decide what columns are going to be on this table, and we're going to keep it super simple, and we're just going to have 2 columns, one for which is a string value and is called name, and one an integer value which is called is complete. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and run PHP artisan migrate. If you rolled back your migrations, you should do this as well. Basically, all you want to make sure is that you have your list items table inside your table plus. Okay, so our models and migrations are created now, and just to quickly recap, basically migrations are to create tables in or edit tables in the database. And this is just basically our structure of that table. And then for models, like there's a lot you can do with models, but basically basic version, just to keep it super simple, basically this list item model is just how we're going to access this list items table. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is actually make our to-do list work. So we're going to have you type something in here and then click this button, and then it will basically just save it to the database. So let's just get that working. Okay, to make our text input here actually work, we need to wrap it in a form element. Okay, so we got our label, input, and button wrapped in a form element, and we gave it a method of post. We're soon going to populate this action, but I need to mention that one thing you need to keep in mind when working with forms in Laravel is that it needs one of these CRSF tokens, basically for every form. And you don't really have to worry too much about it, but basically it's for security purposes. So just keep in mind that you always need one of these inside of a form tag. Okay, so let's go ahead and populate the action value. So the action value is basically what's going to happen when we click this submit button, the save button. You define this as like a route. So I'll explain what a route is pretty soon, but let me just define this action value. Okay, so you can kind of just read this and it should just make sense that the action is when we click this save button, we will hit this route, and the route is called save item. If you don't know what route is, we're going to go through that right now. Okay, so you're going to open web.php, and then this is all of our routes, and obviously we only have one right now for the entire application. And basically, if you don't know what routes are basically what does your application do on like a certain action, basically. So when you go to this page or you click this button or anything like that, what do you want your application to do? Okay, so this is the default route, and I'll just kind of explain what it does real quick. So basically, when you go to this route in the URL page, so basically like this, if you were to like just hit slash, which is technically just like the home page, and same with local hosts like that, it's just that's the default route. What do you do? And right now it just returns this view. So if I were to comment this out and I would go here, like technically the page doesn't show up, right? Because obviously we're hitting the route and nothing, we're not telling it to do anything. So I'm going to put it back, and then there we go. Okay, it shows up again. Okay, so to create a route, I'm just going to copy and paste the default route, and there's a couple things we need to change. So our form element has a method of post, which means that we have to make our route a post route. Now the first argument is basically what URL to hit to trigger this or to fire this route. So I'm just going to go ahead and call it save item. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a name value. I'm going to give it the same name value as basically the route. So this is how the action item knows which route to point to. You technically don't have to give this a name value, but if you want to have this action item as this route, you basically have to name it like this. It's basically a Laravel way to kind of like organize your routes and kind of have them in like if you want to name the specific things. Okay, so we defined our route, and now actually if we go to our form and we click the save button, you will actually see that it goes to our route URL. So you can see in the URL now we have save item route. Okay, so but technically right now our form is working. We can submit it, and it's hitting our endpoint, which is great. Okay, so our route is working, but you generally don't want your like endpoint logic to just be inside the web.php file. So what we're going to do is we're going to basically move this logic to a controller method. Laravel has another method for that, or another command for that. Okay, so it's PHP artisan make controller and then to-do list controller. Go ahead and run that. And then inside app HTTP controllers, we can see that we have our new to-do list controller. Okay, now that we created our controller, we want to edit our route to hit a method inside our controller. So the first thing we need to do is import our controller at the top of the file, and then edit our route to hit a method inside the controller. So just like this, we import at the top, and then we kind of define that this controller is going to hit this method when this route is hit. So now we actually have to like define the method. And we're just going to do the exact same thing that I did before, return our view. Okay, and now our form basically should work just as it did before. So we click the save button, and yeah, so it hits our route, and it's basically now, instead of doing all of the work in web.php, it's now hitting the controller method. Okay, so that basically makes our code a little bit more organized now that we're using our controller. And now we basically actually want to save our item. Okay, so we're going to import our model at the top, and our save item method is going to take a request object. Our request object is basically everything we're passing into from our form to our endpoint. So we're going to see this input value inside this method. So if you ever want to see what you're passing in through, what I do is I just log out the request method. Okay, so right now I'm logging out everything that we're passing into this method. So if you want to look at your logs, you go to storage, logs, and the Laravel log. Let's clear all the errors out. Okay, so this is our Laravel log, and all we're going to do is we're going to see what values are being passed into this function when we hit our endpoint. So let's go ahead and click our button. And then, so this is the value being passed in. So we have a token, which is that CRSF token that I mentioned earlier. And then the list item, which is null because I didn't enter anything. So let's go ahead and type in just random stuff. And then there we go. Okay, so logged out the same thing. And you can see that this time we're actually getting like the value I inputted. So basically we can take this and just save it to the database. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of the logs. And then now we want to just create a new list item. So let's define a variable. Okay, so we defined a variable called new list item, and all we really need to do is define the values on it. So name equals, this is basically how you save items to the database. So you define a new one, we're setting the name, and this is what we're passing in through the request, and we're setting the default value for is complete. So is complete starts off as 0 because we're just creating basically a brand new one. So now let's see if it works. So if I call this item new item and I click save, and it didn't work. Let's see. Oh, right, because I have to, the URL is wrong. Okay, so I wasn't importing it correctly. So let's reset that. New item 2. All right, there's a typo there. New item 2. Click save item. And then it's still not working. What am I doing? Oh, it's models. There we go. Okay, I think I got the right pathing this time. Okay. Okay, this should work. Click save item. There we go. Okay, and then we go back to our table plus and we refresh, and there we go. You see that we have a new row in the table, and this is exactly what I inputted. Okay, so things are looking good. Our list items are being saved to the database. But obviously, as you can kind of tell, that we're not actually listing off the items here. Like there's no actual list. We're just able to save them right now. So what we want to do is on our initial route, we want to return all the lists and then kind of render them on the page. Okay, so on our default route here, so right now we're just returning the view. So we basically want to do the exact same thing. So we're going to create a new method inside our to-do list controller that basically handles the default route. Okay, so all I did is I changed our default route to now hit our method called index inside our to-do list controller. And then our index method literally does the exact same thing. It just returns the welcome page. So we want to pass in our new items, our list items, to this view. Okay, and to pass values into our view, it's actually pretty easy. The view takes a second parameter. So we're going to go ahead and call it list items. And then we're going to just right now return all of them. We're using the model to basically return all the values in this table. So right now you're not going to see anything in the view, but the values are being passed back. Now we basically just have to render it in our page. So Laravel Blade actually has like a pretty good way of actually just rendering lists. So I have to double check, but I'm pretty sure it's just like a for each. So I'm just going to quickly Google it. Okay, so it is a for each. from our index, we're passing in a list items value, and we're looping over each list item and then just kind of displaying the name. So this is fetching everything from my database. So right now, when I refresh the page, it should show our view. There we go. Okay, so, but the problem is that right now, if I were to create a new item, you're going to see that it errors out. And obviously that's because the error is obviously undefined variable list items, which means since we're hitting this route, we're not passing back this value with this route. So all we have to do is pretty much copy and paste this to our save item route, and then it should fix itself. So let's just refresh the page, and there you go. So, okay, so now another thing is, there's probably another thing that you might have noticed is that every time I refresh the page, it's going to give me this continue form submission, and that's because we're in this route. So we don't want to continue going to this route. We technically just want to redirect back to the home page route. All we're going to do is, instead of returning this view, we're going to redirect it back to the default route. So now, every time I create a new method, instead of going to that route, it's redirecting us back to the default route, and you can see that it just refreshes the page and it just adds it as we go. Okay, so right now our to-do list is looking pretty good. We can technically add as many items as we want, but the one thing we did do earlier is we added a is complete column to our list items table. So we basically just want to be able to mark items off as like completed. So the first thing we need to do is kind of just show a button, I guess, next to them that just like marks them complete. So let's do that. Okay, so all I did was put a button next to our list item. So this is what it looks like. We just have a button marked complete next to the name. And then I made it not look like complete garbage, so I just added some styles to the element. Right now, it's not going to do anything when you click it. So we basically have to do the same thing we did for this button to this button. So we need to wrap it in a form element. Okay, so I wrapped the button in a form element, and we need to create a new route. So this route will just be called like mark complete. Mark complete. So let's go ahead and define this route. Now, okay, so we created the route. Now we need to create the method inside our controller. So right now it should just refresh the page. Okay, great. So obviously it doesn't do anything right now, but we're just kind of, we can see that it's hitting our route. So like our old method, we don't actually want to return the view. We want to redirect back to our index method. So let's continue that. There we go. Now we need to think of a way that how do we know which one we're clicking on, right? So we need to pass, each of these have like a unique name or a unique ID. So we need to pass in the ID to the endpoint. So how do we do that? So in our route, we're going to basically pass in an ID like this, and then it will take a param ID. So that, but now inside the route, we have to pass in a second value, and the value is going to be the list item ID. Okay, so right now we're passing in an ID to our route. And I'm just going to quickly recap how we're doing that. So we're looping over, in our for each, we're looping over each list item, right? And each list item, as you can see from our table, has a primary ID, or just like an ID column, which is basically a unique identifier. So we know, because you can technically have names that are exactly the same. So how would you know which one you're clicking on? Just by like the name, right? So you can see this one's ID 3, 4, 5. And then, so we need to pass in that ID to the route. So luckily our route can take a second parameter like this, and all we're doing is we're passing in the ID value into the mark complete route. And then to define it in your web.php, it's like this. So you change the URL to pass in, take in an ID. And then inside the method, all you're going to do is have a parameter inside the method called ID. And then as you can see, as I'm logging it, so I'll click this button. So this, when I click this one, it should log out ID1. And there we go, Laravel, in our log, we have ID1. And then when I click like this one's going to be 8 and 7. So then we're going to see, 8 first, because I clicked 8 first, and 7. There we go. So now we know which one we're passing through, and we're able to kind of edit that one specifically. We're passing in the ID. Now we need to edit the actual record. So how do we do that? Okay, so we need to fetch the list item that goes by this ID. So Laravel has an easy way to do this with just finding it. So we're going to define a variable for list item, and then I'm going to log out this list item just to make sure we're getting the right one, which like mostly for demonstration purposes, we already know we're passing the right ID, so we can just kind of safely assume this will work, but just for demonstration purposes, let's do it. All right, so we're doing the last one, DFG, and there we go. So we're logging out the ID 8, the name's DFG, and is complete is 0. So now we basically, all we need to do is just save it. So I'm going to remove these logs just to clean it up so it looks a little bit easier to read. So pretty much exactly the same as what we did in our save item, except, so we're fetching it, we're setting the value to 1, and then we're clicking save. We're not clicking save, you know what I mean. We're, saving the record. And then we're redirecting back to our index page. Okay, so let's test if our mark complete button actually works now. So we're going to test it with our first list item. So the name is this should work, and in our database the ID is 1. And then you can see that the is complete column is 0. So when we click this, we're not going to see anything change. But if you refresh our database, you can see that the is complete value changed to 1. So it is working. One thing that we can do is basically make it that the list only shows items that aren't completed. So basically anything that's completed won't show up on this list. So this will be the final thing we do, and then it's basically done. So all we really have to do to change that is just change this query. So right now we're turning every single one. All we want to do is add a condition to this. So this is also pretty easy to do with Laravel. So we change it to where is complete is 0, we get. So pretty self-explanatory, but we're basically querying, this is basically just an SQL query where we get all the list items where is complete is 0. So when we refresh the page, that one's going to disappear. And now each one that we click is going to be removed from the list. And there we go. We basically have our to-do list. Okay, so our to-do list is working and it does everything we want it to do. I hope this kind of gave you a basic understanding of building applications with Laravel. If I missed anything, or if there's something you want to know that we didn't cover in this video, feel free to leave a comment below. But yeah, that's basically it. Thanks for watching, guys. See ya.